see if other people join us. Thanks for those of you out there who are here joining us. I'm pleased to welcome you to the final of our weekly seminars here in School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. I'm especially pleased to welcome Shaowen Wang from the University of Illinois. Before I introduce, I want to take a moment and acknowledge the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, a land which touches the shared waters and all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We're grateful to be using this space and welcoming Shaowen from Illinois, where he's professor and head of Department of Geography and Geographic Information Science. He's the Richard and Margaret Romano Professorial Scholar and an affiliate professor in the Department of Computer Science, Department of Urban and Regional Planning, and the School of Information Sciences, all at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. The work he's going to talk about today, some of it at least, is the work that he does as the founding director of the CyberGIS Center for Advanced Digital and Spatial Studies at UIUC, which he founded in 2013. He served as the associate director of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, for CyberGIS from 2010 to 2017, and led NCSA's Earth and Environment theme from 2014 to 2017. His general research interests include geographic information systems in science, advanced cyber infrastructure and cyber GIS, complex environmental and geospatial problems, computational and data sciences, high performance and distributed computing, and spatial analysis and modeling. I've gotten to know Shaowen over the years through our interactions, one of them through the University Consortium on Geographic Information Sciences, where he was on the board of directors from 2009 to 2012 and was president from 2016 to 2017. He has also served as a member of the board of Earth Sciences and Resources of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine from 2015 to 2020. And just so grateful that you're here to talk about your work in geospatial data sciences. As one of the contexts, there's lots of contexts. We have a number of data scientists here in the school, and I see some joining us here in the audience. We're also in the middle of a search on climate adaptation, with one of the themes that being data science. So we're interested in continuing to think about how data science fits within the school more broadly. So this talk is very well timed, and I thank you for joining us. And please take it away, Shaowen.
Thank you very much, Ben, for your kind introduction. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here speaking with you about data-intensive geospatial understanding. Let me see if I could get my screen shared. Can you see my screen, Dan?
Yes.
Awesome. Let me put in the presentation mode. All good?
Looks good.
Thanks. Yeah, so my talk is titled today here, Data-Intensive Geospatial Understanding in the Era of AI and Cyber GIS. Just a quick motivation about the topics I will cover today. As we all know, the many grand challenges and the wicked problems of the day related to environment and sustainability. Solving them is increasingly dependent on geospatial analysis, modeling, and observation. Produces tons of data, needs a lot of data, requires tools and software around the data. And this is essentially the convergence trend we're experiencing. And speaking of geospatial data or spatial big data here, I'm sure you could have come up with a lot of popular V notions. But if we look at the characteristics of geospatial data in a critical way, I suppose you would agree with me, these are just a subset of characteristics of geospatial big data, including such data is really heterogeneous. from many domains, just like what I showed one slide ago, those many different applications and challenges. And this data tend to be dynamic, and it's coming all the time and increasingly massive because each of us today is producers of such data, as well as you would be like me, carry my devices all the time, and we're part of the production of such data. And it's large scale, many global problems we're interested in solving is dependent on such data, and increasingly fine granularity at individual level and very high spatial temporal resolutions. Oftentimes, we need to have distributed access to such data because the data is produced in a distributed way. And this data involves privacy and security concerns sometimes. So if you combine all these characteristics, this making geospatial big data really challenging to deal with sometimes, but very important, certainly, to many scientific problems and societal challenges we're facing. Give you a quick example here. If I would go visit you, sorry, I would not be in your room today, but this is a popular location I went through all the time, Chicago. And the top two images are Chicago Airport, O'Hare Airport. If you are road warriors like Dan, I think you would be familiar with this location. But to tell you that this is actually coming from tweets of a few weeks, just location-based social media like tweets capturing the infrastructure of Chicago really well, just through a few weeks. This is unthinkable. If you would be telling me a few decades ago, I would be laughing at you coming from my, geospatial sort of survey background. But here we are. From social signals, you could actually get this. And this must be tons of bits and bytes. If I would ask you how many zeros in a quintillion, or whether you're familiar with the term at all, if I would be in your room, I would wait for your answers. But here I'll just show you. It's kind of hard to get my head around these numbers, but quintillion is 18 zeros there. Well, if I would say a big computer today, actually this computer will be online next year. It's Aurora in the Argonne National Lab. It does one or even more than one quintillion calculations per second. And it's focused on AI capabilities. And you might ask me, say, why do I care? Well, a computer like this will in your pocket in about a decade. Because the computer in your pocket today was a big computer 10 years ago. So this is quite irrelevant, as I'll show you during the rest of my talk. But step back for a second. For the evolution of science, in the past several hundred years, we've been used to experiment, observation, theory. These are three modalities of scientific practice. But only several decades, and in fact, a few past decades, the introduction of AI and data science into our scientific practice, and of course, computational science has been now a key pillar of scientific practice for over half a century. But this is happening rather quickly to close the loop from the conventional scientific practice to the new modalities, AI, data science, and computational science. And this essentially motivates the development of CyberGIS, defined as geographic information science and systems based on advanced cyber infrastructure. In the context of the big data, computational science and AI, of course, drives the development of CyberGIS. And from the technological aspects, but also there are scientific aspects pulling the development of CyberGIS. First, GIS is going beyond cartographic mapping, although that was the root of GIS when GIS appeared in the late 60s and early 70s, last century, my God. But if you look at these transitions, we are still trying to navigate, GIS is well known for managing maps, deriving maps, right, based on our understanding of patterns. But increasingly, we are getting to the process of driving the changes of the patterns. So that's simulations and associated models. And we also see the need to combine quantitative and qualitative information and data. Increasingly, spatial data is becoming spatial temporal data. But GIS is still conventional. GIS approaches, at least, are still very much locked into just the spatial part. And also the sort of dichotomy between space and place, space being rigid and precise and place being vague and fuzzy. Now we have many problems requires, again, the representation of both the space and place. So this changes and transitions pushing the development of GIS beyond conventional GIS approaches. And for popular definition, you can look up this Wikipedia page. But a major sort of part of the CyberGIS vision has to do with this democratization of accessing cyber infrastructure and high performance computing for tackling a variety of environmental sustainability challenges. We'll come back to this point later in my talk. So the rest of my talk is organized through this outline, basically divided into 4 components, from the top to the bottom, tell you a little bit about several computation data intensive applications and scientific problems. And that motivates the development of geospatial data science. And from the bottom to the top, the good news is there is rapid progress made on cyber infrastructure and advanced computing that in turn enables the development of CyberGIS. We'll meet in the middle at the end of my talk. So many computation data intensive applications and sciences, some examples shown on the right side of the slide. Recognize forest is part of your school name, so I pick up this example. If I would ask you based on remote sensing imagery, say, whether this is wetland or forest, well, it's hard to tell because these are sort of two-dimensional imagery. So this is a LiDAR for the same area. And you get a better sense because the LiDAR is able to get down to the canopies and see some sort of gaps. For instance, here is likely to be, for instance, a river channel along those lines. Well, I'm from Illinois. I got to show you an example county of Illinois. Here is quite an interesting landscape there down south Illinois there. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the area, but it has, a little bit of urban, of course, quite a bit of cropland, and also forest there. It's a hard problem, using geospatial data to distinguish these different land use types. So what we did, if I could, what we did is to combine LiDAR data with traditional remote sensing, because the LiDAR provides the vertical representations of the landscape, and this together has the better power of deciphering the land cover land use changes there. So we developed this 3-dimensional representation as part of a neural network, convolutional neural network. And the idea here is you need to adapt this network to incorporate the 3-dimensional information from LiDAR. If you would just have a typical convolutional neural network, that would not be suitable to directly work with this spatial information. And then, of course, there are multiple layers getting to the abstractions in the end for the land use types in our case. So an example, we would contrast between what conventional kind of classifiers using, for instance, SVM as an example, support vector machine, compared to this neural network, 3-dimensional convolutional neural network. You could clearly see improvement just at the bottom 2 examples here. The left is the conventional benchmarking we did, and the right example here is done through the three-dimensional convolution neural network we developed. And you could see there are some sort of false classification there, clearly as part of the river channels here got properly labeled. But there are some other more sophisticated examples, even related to some urban land use types. So the good news is, through this kind of a machine learning approach, you are able to synthesize multiple types of geospatial data and to do a better job at a classic example from the land use science. But the bad news is here, as I quickly summarize from this slide, even for a single county to get this network trained and then the data processed and ultimately apply the application process, the classification process, excuse me, to really get to the maps you saw one slide ago. This takes typically about a week time of a decent small scale supercomputer to get the job done. Now, that's just a single county, right? We got over 3,000 in the US, and you might be familiar with this three-dimensional elevation program, which is a USGS national data program to produce LiDAR coverage across the lower 48 states, vertically within 10 centimeter resolution, horizontally a couple of points per square meters. So this would get us petabytes of data for a single scan. And USGS is working with the partners to get this data product completed for the US in the next few years. Now, if you associate this data with the problem I mentioned from the past several slides, and also the computation data challenge I was alluded to, you would say this is both a big problem and an opportunity. How do you harness this data to achieve fine granularity land cover classification, right, across, say, the entire states? And I think you would be easily convinced even the big computer I mentioned at the early part of my talk might not be enough for the kind of challenge we hope to resolve. So I mentioned example of natural environment, mostly land cover classification, but there are problems from the social space as well. I already mentioned the Twitter example, but for instance, the social unrest detected from news media and social media on the left side of this slide. And this data are coming all the time and representing the population and human dynamics. So obviously we want to figure out what's going on. And to do so is certainly not an easy task, especially if you have to work with the conventional GIS capabilities. How do you represent the spatial part, temporal part, and the human dimension together? And the spatial part is multi-scale, the temporal part is multi-scale as well. And of course, the human dimension is multi-dimensional. And you need to configure all these three dimensions in an interconnected fashion so that you could engage analytics. And your data might become even useful for simulation modeling. So this is certainly not something you could directly tackle through any of your existing GIS tools on your personal computers. So we need new data models, and we need new analytical capabilities to get into this type of problem solving. So I mentioned kind of the data intensity and the computation intensity, and this is an example of collaboration intensity. So a bioenergy infrastructure problem we were trying to solve, meaning the production of bioenergy crops, mostly in the Midwest here, but the bioenergy consumption a lot of times happening along the coast at you guys' place. So how do you transport, from the energy production to the energy consumption? And the biomass is different from other energy sources. You actually have to process them in time so that the energy is preserved. And this is a location optimization problem across multiple scales, and involving stakeholders are not necessarily on the same page, driven by very different interests. And we're dependent on data from a variety of domains, from the energy infrastructure space, as well as from land use space, and from environmental quality space. So how do you solve this problem with different stakeholders, with different competing interests, dependent on different data sources? And the problems require solutions such as spatial optimization has to be done at large scale computational levels. So that's another example, not only computationally intensive, but also data intensive and collaboration intensive. So this is example through this online collaboration. You could pull these data sources together, you could have stakeholders' inputs into the same environment, and then evaluate the different scenarios and ask what if questions, and then drive the consensus and get to hopefully optimal solutions in the end. So hopefully I provided several examples that you would be convinced, wow, this is really interesting, but also challenging. And at the same time, requires new approaches, which we characterize as the frontiers of geospatial data science. That's really is a transdisciplinary fusion among three broad domains from the geospatial sciences, technologies, and the mathematical statistical sciences, and the cyber infrastructure computational sciences, sort of geospatial data sciences intersecting among these three and leading to the advances of AI data science and CyberGIS. So what's the gist and nature of this transdisciplinary fusion? Well, one very basic synergy here is the fusion of spatial understanding and knowledge with the computational understanding and knowledge. You know, from the spatial side, we have knowledge about the patterns, as I mentioned earlier, and also spatial dependence across both local levels as well as long distances. The heterogeneity example I mentioned from the land cover classification, and certainly, you know, how to represent different spatial factors and processes, and oftentimes they involve uncertainty. So this is sort of spatial thinking. Computationally, we often have to trade off between complexity and intensity, and uncertainty versus validity and performance, you know, how quickly you get answers through computers, and how reliable are your answers. And the challenging and exciting part is the scale, right? Across both spatial scales and computational scales. And we've been dealing with this kind of fusion from the computational and spatial sides for a long time, but the scalable problem solving is really new to us. You know, how do you get to large scales and multi-scales with very data intensive representations and through high-end computing resources? So to make this as straightforward as possible to understand, so if I have multi-dimensional spatial representations of the same environment, this is, say, you know, multi-themed representation, and I would have trouble to fit this whole thing into my, let's say, personal computer, or even small scale, high performance computer. So how do I get this problem solved? Well, we have to break down into parts. And when we break down into parts, we need to allocate them to different computational processes and resources. And in the end, we hope to recover the entire problem and manage the uncertainty associated. And of course, for the computing part, you want all the good things about computing, right? Performance, get answers quickly, and hopefully answers are reliable and reproducible, because when you divide them up, you want the next scholar to do the same process to get to the same answer as opposed to different answer, right? So all these computationally related issues have to be resolved. Well, it turned out to be a pretty deep and complicated stack in order to achieve this. So this is very much dependent on cutting edge cyber infrastructure, which I'll tell you a little bit more, but also across data and computation and operational issues and how do you integrate different computational data resources. And of course, at the cyber infrastructure level, you would want to have scalable data and analytics, multi-scale modeling, interactive support for your analytics, and for the spatial decision-making problem I mentioned, as well as the collaboration support. And this is, again, serving a pretty broad set of domain communities and sciences as listed at the top of the slide. So this is a good segue to some good news I have. That's the progress on the advanced computing and cyber infrastructure. And represents innovation opportunity from geospatial perspective. So traditionally for high performance computing, a variety of science domains are driven to get calculations faster and faster, mostly for modeling and simulations. That certainly is very useful for some geospatial applications, but a lot of geospatial problems and applications are dependent on big data analytics. And big data analytics is very different from traditional HPC-based work, because oftentimes when we engage geospatial analytics, we tend to look at maps, exploratory data analysis. So it's a very instantaneous feedback to scientists and users. And that's not the case for traditional HPC. HPC basically does the work. It would take Dan and me a coffee and a meal time before we could get answers from those big machines queues. And so how do you bridge this gap, right, between big data analytics and the HPC, traditional HPC? And then, this cloud comes in because that's service-oriented modality and infrastructure. So CyberGIS essentially is integrated all these three together into what we call a Roger supercomputer that is data-driven and provides interactive support, and it's scalable both computation and data analytics, and it's integrated in a way that is provisioned for the computational power to serve as cloud services. So you could think of Roger as the marriage among multiple computing modalities, and on top of Roger with CyberGIS software and tools to deploy. If you want to know a little bit more about the specs of this small-scale supercomputer, you could go to CyberGIS Center website and then look down the menu of research. There's an infrastructure option. You would get to this page. Now, transition to CyberGIS. In a nutshell, this was about a decade ago. I was preparing my NSF career proposal. I was imagining at that time, as we just started observing the data deluge and the demand for computational processes that are much more sophisticated than our personal computer was able to handle. So I was imagining GIS is going out of your personal computing into this cyber environment where you have high performance computing, big data transformation to knowledge, and interactive visual analytics, and collaboration support. So that would lead to a completely new landscape of geospatial research because this is opening up a new box. So we convinced NSF to basically fund a project to set up the individual parts of CyberGIS from this sort of simple vision I described to you to concrete tools and software components that are established on the national cyber infrastructure resources such as XC, as well as a local high performance computer like Roger. So the idea here is we have multiple modalities of CyberGIS software, from CyberGIS Gateway essentially is to democratize the access to CyberGIS and the cyber infrastructure through simple online tools. Scientists, users would not need to become GIS or CyberGIS experts to be able to benefit from the power of CyberGIS. And then you also have CyberGIS Toolkit, which essentially is a set of scalable algorithms implemented to take advantage of high performance and distributed computing resources natively, because the GIS has been long time evolving in sequential computing environments, such as our personal computers, without having the capability of taking advantage of scalable parallel computing resources. So CyberGIS Toolkit essentially is a collection of open source modules, algorithms that are directly harnessing parallel and high performance computing resources. And the middleware is just to bring different cyber infrastructure resources and points for a variety of geospatial applications. So you could think of these different modalities of CyberGIS software now emerged to bridge the gap between a variety of geospatial discovery and innovation opportunities and the cyber infrastructure at the bottom. So over the past decade, the CyberGIS software ecosystem has expanded. This is an old map representing the user community accessing CyberGIS software and tools for different research and education purposes. And also the scientific progress made, this was a decade ago when this was initially conceptualized. We sampled a collection of driving science use cases. And until about recently, in addition to tackling the computation data challenges and the collaborative problem solving, this really is becoming more intriguing is because of the progress made on CyberGIS and geospatial data science, do we have a shot at posing new questions? Those questions we got limited to ask because we got so used to the computer box we've had. If we relax the limitations of those boxes, could new questions emerge? So one example is this geo-expression framework. For a long time, the GIS community has been dealing with the understanding of spatial and spatial temporal patterns. But as I mentioned earlier, so what are the really processes driving the changes of the patterns? So if you think about, at any location, there are actually a number of processes simultaneously taking place. So how do we overlay those processes, representing them through large-scale computational frameworks? This is really, I think, exciting, opening up, I think, some new boxes, compared to the old way of thinking about representing patterns and how to overlay the patterns together. Now we try to overlay these processes together, addressing the concurrency of the processes, taking a spatially explicit approach. But, the power of combining such processes in a concurrent fashion and with the location as a major power of resolving the integration of the processes, it will get us to the potential for understanding the interconnectedness of the different processes, in this case would be a complex urban system. And how do you address, food, energy, water nexus? And how do you take geospatial process into the very core of linking these systems together and understanding their interactions? So here's an example of understanding the urban metabolism and see the potential of making cities greener. So I want to do a quick wrap up here, making a gear switch. This is, to me at least, super exciting because the technology is going forward. There are a lot of wicked grand challenges for us to tackle, to form teams and take advantage of convergence science approaches. But at the same time, I see a digital divide is quite a problem because, for instance, I have some really easy and direct access to big data compute resources. But I see a lot of colleagues and friends of mine might not have such access. So that's a digital divide. And how do you democratize such access? Not just the access itself, but the knowledge associated to this access to everyone to derive data-intensive geospatial understanding. So we've been trying to figure out how this could work as the field is evolving very rapidly. So years back through NSF support, we basically gathered a group of CyberGIS fellows who would collaborate to come up with educational modules that would be widely available, not only to our own institutions, but to broader communities. There was a University of Washington scholar, Frida Rieker, I think she left. Anyway, and we organized multiple summer schools. This is one in 2017, focused on collaborative problem solving with CyberGIS and geospatial data science. And that was the happy crowd. You might recognize some folks. My longtime friend, Mike Goodchild, was in the back, and he's in Seattle. But anyway, so that's the distribution of the scholars came to that summer school, mostly US, but I think there are a few folks from Europe. A more recent one was this reproducible problem solving with CyberGIS and geospatial data science, because we recognize reproducibility, especially linked with large scale computation and big data analytics, increasingly difficult to reproduce the scientific workflows. So this summer school was right before the pandemic, and I missed the excitement there on our campus. But more recently, as part of the step at tackling the COVID challenges, NSF supported us to work with a group of geospatial fellows to understand the impacts of COVID on a variety of socio-environmental dimensions. But the efforts I mentioned quickly here, really just a small sample of addressing this digital divide, and how do we get broader community collaborate to come up with educational strategies and workforce development approaches to making the advances of CyberGIS and geospatial data science more accessible, and make the access to high performance computing cyber infrastructure much more easier for broader communities to take advantage of these powerful capabilities, and to also nurture the next generation to open the box to ask new questions. So that, leads us to a new opportunity recently announced as part of the NSF Harness the Data Revolution. We are one of the 5 institutes. I think UW actually has an institute focused on planetary physics and astronomy. So the vision here is, again, using the same outline I presented to you. So critical spatial thinking, you might have noticed, is so crucial here, coming from the top to the bottom, guiding this very integration and synthesis across these 4 knowledge domains. But of course, from the bottom to top, rapid digital transformation enabled by the technological advances. So my argument is integration and synthesis across a number of domains are so critical to tackle the grand challenges and the wicked problems. And we have so many of them. So our new institute is called Iguide, stands for Institute for Geospatial Understanding through an Integrative Discovery Environment. We have 11 institutions. Illinois is the lead institution. I'm the PI, but we also have 10 other institutions listed on this slide. This is the leadership group of the institute. In the interest of time, I'm not going to introduce individually these folks, but we got an amazing team here representing a broad spectrum of domains, from the data science as well as from domain science and from cyber infrastructure, and also education, workforce development experts. So the mission of the Institute is to transform geospatial data intensive sciences through integration of AI and the CyberGIS, reproducible data intensive analytics and modeling, fair data principles, and innovative education workforce development programs. Essentially, these elements, as I was alluded to throughout my talk so far, we have a set of partners identified who are excited to work with us in this institute, because to tackle the kind of challenges. I mentioned a few, as was another interesting problem I'll show you next slide. Definitely requires not only academic folks, but folks from industry and other sectors. So here's the representative problem our institute is set up to tackle. Let's say you look at the map and this diagram on the slide. If we get shocks like in the Midwest, where I am, either flood or drought, that would change the production of crops. And this production change would get possible impacts through global trade on the production of crops from other places, such as Brazil, because U.S. Midwest crops, soy and corn, these kind of crops, especially soy, would be popular crops in Brazil as well. Let's say it's a major disaster, and crop production is down in Midwest, and the crop production might be driven up in Brazil. That leads to land use change, and then that could lead to the change of biodiversity. So this interconnected changes across socioeconomic environmental systems is getting better understood by related scientific communities, but it's still very hard to quantify and predict this kind of changes. And across multiple geospatial scales, certainly you need different types of data from a variety of domains, and you need to piece the puzzle together. But this kinds of challenges are critical sustainability challenges of our time. And how do you decode and decipher the interplays of the complex socioeconomic environmental systems and set up data to inform models and again, the concurrent processes involved in different models, and how do you integrate them together? So that's an example of scientific problems we're tackling as part of this institute. And how do we get there? Again, as I mentioned, you would need to work with the different science communities, and they already have their own cyber infrastructure. We need to pull them together, and then we need to have innovative geospatial data science approach to have the data wrangled efficiently so that scientists work on the problem solving as opposed to getting the data ready. And then how do you resolve the different representational issues, uncertainty issues I mentioned from the spatial perspective, as well as from the computational perspective, as I noted earlier, the holy grail of geospatial data science to address multi-large scale problems. So this leads to possible innovation of a new platform to fill the missing middle of our harness data revolution ecosystem. So we are organizing different community activities at the different conferences. So this is an example coming up quickly next February, a symposium on data intensive geospatial understanding. We're taking this proactive approach, reaching out to different communities and organizing, events like this to engage the community, to learn from the community, but at the same time, share what we do as part of this institute. So if you have any events or community mechanisms you feel like we need to be working with you on, happy to follow up with you. I want to acknowledge several agencies here, especially NSF. We've been fortunate to be supported by these agencies, particularly NSF, for a good number of years, which are critical to pursue the kind of work I presented today. Requires sustainable funding to achieve the kind of the impacts we desire. And of course, what I presented today, not only just my own work, I'm very limited in terms of my brain power. So the folks from the broader communities got surrounded by many smart people, credits to the evolution of the community of CyberGIS and geospatial data science in the past few decades. Kudos to their contributions and energy. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. I learned from Dan, this is the final seminar of your quarter. And certainly all the best wishes for your holiday season. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Shaowen. Such a extensive tour of so much of the work you've been doing. For those of you who are online, we can certainly elevate you to ask questions verbally, or feel free to enter them into the chat or the Q&A box. I might start with a question on the workforce development kind of work that you've been doing, and sort of thinking about how to address the digital divide you mentioned between domain scientists who have a lot of knowledge about data collection and about processes in a particular system or in connected systems, and how people in those fields might approach the challenges you're talking about. You spent a lot of time, I know, developing the sort of middleware tools to bring the cloud and the power of the cloud and the resources of geospatial computation closer to usefulness to people who may not have the development capabilities but know how to use software. I think of it almost as a stark choice for a domain scientist. Do I go and seek those kinds of tools specifically developed by others who can help, who are sort of in the cyber infrastructure world, developing like the tools that you're developing? Should I look for those, or should I develop my own capacity to develop tools myself? And what's involved, the amount of time and effort that's involved in developing that capacity. Yet by developing that capacity myself, I can design the analytics and the tools and access the data and the models that I want, rather than relying on somebody else. How do you see that, your role as a middleware developer, but also in terms of the capacity development within the sciences?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. I think it's still a very evolving situation. There might not be a clear-cut answer to the great question you posed. I would say, back to the years I started doing this kind of work, I almost had to develop from scratch, right? But now a lot of capabilities exist that they're not perfect, right? They're not cookie cutter things folks could directly pick up for their specific problems, but they could at least start from somewhere. They did not usually have to start from scratch in the recent years. But there are still a massive opportunity space for innovation because especially for interdisciplinary problem solving, existing capabilities are not directly sometimes relevant to the problems at hand we have to address. But from workforce point of view, workforce development education point of view, I think what we need to expose to students and the next generation is both a discovery and innovation opportunity, meaning there's still a huge room for innovation, meaning, if you really are passionate about solving environmental sustainability problems, and we certainly are now increasingly dependent on massive geospatial data and associated capabilities, and don't wait for those capabilities to come to you. I think, as the younger generation, would certainly be well positioned today to get into the kind of opportunity space. But at the same time, what's exciting to me most is you have this very fertile intersectional space that requires both domain knowledge and also the knowledge in the data science and technology space, I would say the opportunities are bigger if you could cut across, because the rapid evolution of both on the problem side as well as on the capability side. I would anticipate the capacity will grow just because this intersectional space is growing. I would also see, from our university side, we would need to step up to prepare the students and the next generation to be able to get into this intersectional space, to adapt our curriculum to have room for both domain knowledge as well as for the capacity knowledge and the data science piece. It's not an easy job, because whenever you introduce something, you need to drop something else. But I would say this is, at least to me, a very exciting area associated with a lot of real world problems as well as opportunities.
Yeah, and that gives me an opportunity to acknowledge the co-sponsor of this event, eSciences Institute here at University of Washington. Thank them for getting the word out. If you're here with the eSciences, it looked like they had the wrong time for the talk. If you're arriving now for a 4:30 talk, the talk is recorded, so you can see it. But that model, I think, that you're talking about is very much built into the Sciences Institute here and a lot of other universities. The recognition that what we really need to see is that pairing of the data science capability with the domain science knowledge.
Right. Yeah, there's also recognition of more modular education approaches, making curriculum sort of defined at a finer granularity and having modules so that the students have the flexibility to assemble these modules as they go to, pick up their skill set. There could be a combination of certificates, minors, in addition to majors. So yeah, we basically observe, I would say, some exciting as well as sort of sometimes uncomfortable changes of our education enterprise, to a large degree driven by the kind of topics we discussed today.
Yeah. Anybody else have questions? I have more questions, but I want to be sure and let other people chime in if you have questions. I'm sure we could, Shaowen and I could talk for a long time. We have lots of common interests. I'm particularly interested in the work that you're doing, I think to compare process models with geospatial data. And I'm aware of some of the challenges of parallelizing interactive models, and I think you talked about these challenges and of connected data sets and a lot of the algorithms built in serial, and when you have interacting processes, you have to deal with the sequencing of how those connections cascade through a system, and parallelization can be conceptually really challenging. Have you I'm just curious what the recent advances. I'm interested in this GeoExpression paper that you presented. Are there any interesting ideas in there about how to handle time and sequencing in a parallel environment that you've taken on?
Yeah, that's a really intriguing question, Dan. That's exactly what I was trying to explain there, but I sort of moved through that slide quickly in the interest of the time. But the idea I was trying to explain was that, in the past, because we've been sequential computing dominated for a long time, everything we did for our spatial analysis modeling work was to some degree dominated by that sequential thinking. And then, to move that to the more parallel computing sort of representations, still influenced by that sequential representation. So what I was trying to argue from that dual expression work was we actually have to forget that sequential thinking because the geospatial processes embedded in many domains, by nature, they are parallel and concurrent processes, and we need to represent them directly as opposed to serialize them. Because the sort of cutting edge computer architecture is increasingly now built on parallel representation. It would do us scientifically good if we are able to directly represent our processes into that concurrent forms, because that will directly address this representation mismatch. So that was the sort of the motivation and also simplistic explanation about a geo expression. I argued a departure from the traditional translational approach, meaning, you got a serial model you want to translate to parallel, to scale, and to address large models. So I argued that's not productive, actually should abandon that approach. What I argued is, let's say there are processes that could be spatially explicit and could be concurrent, and there's a way of representing that directly and then take that to the sort of parallel distributed computing architecture.
So rewriting the process representations rather than translating them.
Right, conceptually re-represent that natively as concurrent processes, as opposed to serialize and then do parallelize later.
That has some really interesting, potentially some interesting implications back towards the conception of the process and theory.
Absolutely. That's why it was named as a geo expression, because we hope to have a new way of expressing the processes. Because if it's a native representation of such process interactions and a concurrency, we might have a better shot at posing new questions about these process interactions, as opposed to in the past, we typically take a process one time and try to stitch them together later. A lot of times due to the limitations of computing, because it's oftentimes serialized and later parallelized. So I argue this might not be necessary at all. Why not we go directly at the process interactions and concurrency?
I see that we have a lot of new attendees to the seminar, and I want to welcome you all. I will point out that we had a misadvertisement on the time of the talk. It was and always has been scheduled for 3:30, not 4:30. And apologize for the time getting out there to the eSciences Institute as 4:30. We are recording the talk, and the link for the YouTube channel I'm going to put again in the chat so that you'll be able to see the talk shortly after we finish up here, and apologize again. Somebody has a hand up, but it may be about that question.
And my email is projected on the screen. Feel free to follow up with me if you have, questions after the session.
And Luke Bergman says hi and sorry he missed it.
Yeah, I myself got a little confused where I was supposed to start the talk, but it got helped out by Dan and
the eScience advertisement did say 4:30, so you're all right according to the advertisement, but sorry that we had a miscommunication there.
Do we have some other questions from?
Any but questions from people who didn't even hear the talk, or questions from those who were here, want to follow up on anything? If you do have questions after watching the video of the talk, Shaowen's contact is here, and sounds like he's free to, or welcomes your outreach.
Yeah, happy to.
Well, with that, we are at the end of time, and appreciate your excellent talk and taking the time to join us. I know it's getting later there in the evening, so thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Again, great seeing you, and all the best for the holiday season, and hopefully much better 2022.
Yeah, all the best to you. And again, everybody, I'm just going to put the link one more time for the YouTube channel. The talk will show up there before too long. Sorry about that mix-up. All the best.